The harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the Maple Street Diner's restroom buzzed like a trapped hornet. Eleanor Vance leaned heavily against the chipped porcelain sink, the cold edge biting into her stomach through the thin, scratchy polyester of her uniform. She reached down, her breath hitching in a quiet gasp, and pressed her thumbs into her swollen ankles. The flesh yielded, leaving pale indentations that took far too long to fill back in with color. 65 years old, she stared at the woman in the mirror, searching for the person she used to be. The Eleanor of 2 years ago had smooth, silver-streaked hair kept in a neat bob, wore cashmere cardigans, and smelled of lavender and baking spices. The woman staring back at her now had hair hastily pulled back into a fraying hairnet, dark hollows bruised beneath her eyes, and smelled of stale coffee, industrial grease, and desperation. The name tag pinned slightly crookedly to her breast read simply, Eleanor, not Mrs. Vance, not a retired neonatal nurse who had spent 40 years bringing life into the world. Just Eleanor, the old woman you waved a greasy menu at when you needed a refill on your decaf. She closed her eyes, letting the cold water run over her wrists, trying to wash away the bone-deep ache that seemed to have settled permanently into her lumbar spine. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. This wasn't the golden retirement she and Robert had mapped out on countless Sunday mornings at their kitchen table, surrounded by the warm, sunlit walls of the home they had owned free and clear. Robert. The mere thought of his name was a phantom limb, an ache for something vital that had been cleanly severed. When the pancreatic cancer took him, it hadn't been a gentle fading into the night. It was a brutal 6-month siege that left Eleanor hollowed out, a walking ghost navigating a world that had suddenly lost its gravity. But it wasn't the medical bills that had ruined her. Robert had been meticulous. They had good insurance, a solid pension, and a robust savings account. They had done everything right. They had worked hard, lived modestly, and poured everything else into raising their only son, Harrison. Harrison, the boy she had rocked through colic, the teenager whose college tuition she had funded by picking up grueling double shifts at the hospital, the man whose wedding she had paid for. Eleanor dried her trembling hands on a rough paper towel, remembering the weeks immediately following Robert's funeral. The memories were hazy, blurred by a thick fog of grief and the heavy sedatives her doctor had prescribed just so she could stop crying long enough to sleep. That was when Harrison and Meredith had swooped in. Meredith, her daughter-in-law. Eleanor remembered Meredith sitting on her floral living room sofa, wearing a perfectly tailored black dress that looked more suited for a cocktail party than mourning. Meredith had held Eleanor's hand, her manicured nails sharp against Eleanor's fragile skin, speaking in a voice dripping with a saccharine, practiced sympathy. "Oh, Mom, you look so exhausted," Meredith had cooed, brushing a stray lock of hair from Eleanor's face. "You shouldn't be dealing with all this paperwork. The estate taxes, the probate, it's a nightmare for a grieving widow. You need to rest. Let Harrison take care of his mother." Harrison had sat beside his wife, the picture of a dutiful son. He was 38, a mid-level financial executive who wore expensive suits and drove a car that cost more than Eleanor's first mortgage. He had placed a thick stack of documents on the coffee table, right next to the framed photograph of Robert holding a newborn Harrison. "It's just standard procedure, Mom," Harrison had said, his voice smooth, authoritative, yet layered with what she thought was deep concern. "It's a trust agreement and an estate tax reduction form. It just gives me the legal ability to handle Dad's final medical bills, consolidate the accounts, and make sure the government doesn't take half of what Dad worked for. You won't have to worry about a single bill or bank statement." Eleanor had been so tired. Her bones ached with sorrow. The letters on the document swam before her tear-filled eyes. She hadn't seen the words durable power of attorney or irrevocable asset transfer. She had only seen her son, her flesh and blood, offering to carry a burden she felt too weak to lift. "You'll take care of it, Harry?" she had asked, her voice cracking, using his childhood nickname. "Of course, Mom. I've got you. Just sign here and here." Meredith marked the spots with little yellow sticky notes. She had signed her name 6 times. With those 6 strokes of a pen, driven by a mother's blind trust and a widow's paralyzing grief, Eleanor Vance had signed away her entire life. The realization hadn't come all at once. It was a slow, agonizing drip of poison. It started 3 months later with a letter from a real estate agency, congratulating her on the listing of her home. When a panicked Eleanor called Harrison, the mask of the dutiful son slipped, revealing something cold, calculating, and utterly foreign. Mom, be realistic. Harrison had sighed over the phone, the sound of a busy office in the background. That house is massive. You're living alone, you're getting forgetful. You left the stove on last week, remember? The maintenance is a money pit. Meredith and I decided it's best to liquidate the asset now while the market is hot. It's for your own good. Liquidate the asset? Harrison, it's my home. It's where your father and I... You can't just sell it. I already did, Mom. The papers are signed. You gave me the legal authority to manage the estate, remember? You were practically catatonic. Someone had to step up and make the hard choices. The eviction felt like a physical assault. Men in uniform coveralls packing away 40 years of memories into brown cardboard boxes. When Eleanor went to the bank to withdraw money for a lawyer to fight him, the teller had looked at her with profound pity. I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance. The joint accounts have been closed. The funds were transferred to a corporate LLC account 3 weeks ago. And, well, I shouldn't say this, but your personal credit cards are completely maxed out. Cash advances, mostly. Harrison hadn't just taken the house and the savings. He and Meredith had drained her dry, leveraging her pristine credit score to fund whatever lifestyle they felt they were entitled to, leaving her holding the bag. When she finally confronted him, screaming, weeping, begging him to explain how he could do this to his own mother, his response had chilled her to the marrow. You and Dad held on to that money like dragons hoarding gold, Mom. You didn't know how to make it grow. You're old. What do you need it for? Another knitting circle? I'm in the prime of my career. Meredith and I need to network. We need to show we belong. I took what was eventually going to be mine anyway. Think of it as an early inheritance. I'll send you a monthly stipend. The stipend barely covered the rent of the damp one-room studio apartment on the wrong side of the tracks where she now lived. But even that stopped after 2 months. Things are tight, Mom. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet, Meredith had texted her. A text message. Not even a phone call. The betrayal had nearly killed her. There were nights Eleanor lay on the thin mattress in her studio, listening to the sirens wailing outside, praying she wouldn't wake up. The shame was a suffocating blanket. How could she tell anyone? How could she admit to her friends that the son she had bragged about, the son she had sacrificed everything for, had thrown her away like garbage the moment she was no longer useful? She couldn't, so she disappeared. She changed her number, stopped going to her church, and retreated into the shadows. But hunger is a relentless taskmaster. At 65, with a resume that hadn't been updated since the 1990s, the only place that would hire her without asking too many questions was the Maple Street Diner. Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath, pushed away from the restroom sink, and plastered on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She pushed open the swinging door and stepped back into the cacophony of the diner. The clatter of cheap silverware against ceramic plates, the hiss of the deep fryer, the smell of burnt bacon and stale syrup hit her like a physical force. Vance, Table 4 needs more coffee, and Table 6 has been waiting on their eggs for 10 minutes, barked Gary, the diner's manager, a man half her age with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his forehead and a cruel streak he mistook for leadership. Right away, Gary, Eleanor said smoothly, grabbing a heavy glass coffee pot from the burner. Her shoulders screamed in protest, but she ignored it. You don't get to feel pain when you're one missed paycheck away from sleeping on the street. She moved through the tables with practiced efficiency, a ghost serving the living. She poured coffee for truckers, wiped down sticky syrup spills left by screaming toddlers, and smiled politely at construction workers who called her sweetheart without ever looking at her face. It was grueling, invisible work, but amidst the chaotic blur of the morning rush, there was one constant, a small anchor in Eleanor's turbulent day. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of biting November wind swept into the diner, carrying with it a scattering of dead leaves. Eleanor looked up from wiping down the counter. It was him. He came in exactly at 10:30 a.m., after the breakfast rush and just before the early lunch crowd. He was a tall man, though age had bowed his shoulders slightly. He wore a faded tweed overcoat that looked like it had been bought at a charity shop a decade ago, the elbows threadbare and the collar frayed. A worn flat cap was pulled low over his eyes. He moved with a quiet, deliberate dignity, walking to the small booth in the far corner, away from the windows, away from the noise. He sat down slowly, taking off his cap to reveal thinning silver hair, and neatly folded his hands on the Formica tabletop. Eleanor picked up a menu and a glass of water, making her way over. "Good morning," she said. her voice dropping its artificial customer service pitch, settling into something softer, more genuine. The old man looked up. His eyes were a startling, piercing blue, surrounded by deep, weather-beaten crinkles. There was a profound sadness in those eyes, a quiet, devastating grief that Eleanor recognized instantly. It was the same grief she saw in her own mirror every morning. It takes a broken heart to recognize another. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said. His voice was a rich, gravelly baritone, rough like it hadn't been used in a while, but cultured. He always remembered her name. Most people just looked at the tag. He looked at her. "The usual?" she asked gently. He offered a small, apologetic smile. "Yes, please. Just the chicken noodle soup, and a cup of hot water with lemon if it's not too much trouble." It was the cheapest item on the menu, $2.50. He never ordered a drink, never ordered a side. Eleanor watched as his slightly trembling hands reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a worn leather coin purse. He began to meticulously count out exact change, quarters, dimes, and pennies, stacking them neatly on the edge of the table. The cuffs of his shirt beneath the tweed coat were frayed, and she noticed the leather of his shoes was cracked and peeling, letting in the damp cold of the street. A pang of fierce, maternal protectiveness seized Eleanor's chest. She knew what it was like to count pennies. She knew the precise, humiliating mathematics of deciding whether you could afford to turn on the heat or buy a loaf of bread. "I'll have that right out for you," she said, turning toward the kitchen. When she brought the bowl of soup, she didn't just bring the 2 standard-issue stale saltine cracker packets. Hidden beneath her apron, she had slipped 2 thick, warm slices of the diner's homemade sourdough bread, heavily buttered. She slid the tray onto the table, placing the soup and the bread before him. The man paused, looking at the steaming, buttered bread, then up at Eleanor. I didn't order this. I can't pay for the extra." "It's a mistake from the kitchen," Eleanor lied smoothly, a warm, reassuring smile on her lips. "Gary was just going to throw it out. It's a sin to waste good bread. Please." The man looked at her for a long moment. Those sharp blue eyes seemed to see right through the polyester uniform, right through the exhausted lines on her face, down to her very core. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders eased. "Thank you," he said softly. "You are very kind." "We have to look out for each other," Eleanor murmured. "Enjoy your meal, Mr. Theo," he said. "Theodore. Enjoy, Theo." Over the next few weeks, a quiet, unspoken ritual developed between them. Theo came in every day at 10:30. He always ordered the soup, and Eleanor always found a way to accidentally bring him something extra. A piece of pie that had gotten smashed in the display case, a small side salad that was made by mistake, a fresh cup of actual coffee instead of hot water. Gary, the manager, would have fired her on the spot if he caught her giving away food. Eleanor couldn't afford to lose the job, but she couldn't stop herself either. Her entire life had been defined by caring for others. Her patients, her husband, her ungrateful son. With her family gone, all that suppressed maternal instinct, all that need to nurture, poured out toward this quiet, impoverished old man. In feeding him, she felt a tiny fragment of her own dignity being restored. She wasn't just a victim, she was still someone capable of giving. They rarely spoke for more than a few minutes at a time. The diner was too busy, and Eleanor was always rushing. But in those stolen moments, pouring his coffee, they shared pieces of themselves. She learned that Theo was a widower, too. He had lost his wife 3 years ago. "The house is too quiet now," Theo had said one rainy Tuesday, staring into his coffee cup. "You spend 50 years with someone, their voice becomes the background noise of your life. When the music stops, the silence is deafening." Eleanor had to wipe a sudden tear from her cheek. "I know. Oh, I know exactly what you mean. You find yourself turning around to tell them something funny that happened at the grocery store, and there's just empty air." Theo had looked up, his expression infinitely gentle. "Do you have children, Eleanor? Someone to check in on you?" Eleanor had frozen, the coffee pot trembling in her hand. The shame flared up, hot and bitter in her throat. She couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't say, "My son stole my life and threw me on the street so his wife could buy designer handbags." It was too humiliating. "I have a son," she said, her voice tight, looking away. He's very busy. He works in finance. He has his own life." Theo had watched her carefully. He didn't push. He possessed a rare kind of emotional intelligence, knowing exactly when a wound was too raw to touch. "The world moves very fast for the young," he said softly. "Sometimes they forget who built the roads they run on." It was the most validating thing anyone had said to her in 2 years. For the rest of the day, Eleanor felt a little lighter, her back a little straighter. She wasn't invisible to Theo, but the brutal reality of Eleanor's life was always waiting to drag her back down. November bled into December, bringing freezing rain and biting sleet. The holiday season was a gauntlet for the lonely. The diner was filled with families laughing, shopping bags piled high, Christmas carols blaring endlessly from the jukebox. Every smiling family felt like a physical blow to Eleanor's chest. Her financial situation, already precarious, turned critical. The heating in her terrible little apartment was broken, and the landlord refused to fix it. She was sleeping in her winter coat, wearing 3 pairs of socks. The arthritis in her hands was flaring up so badly that she dropped a tray of glasses, costing her a full day's tips to pay Gary back for the breakages. Thanksgiving came and went. Eleanor had bought a single frozen turkey TV dinner. She had sat on her lumpy mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper, and dialed Harrison's number. She just wanted to hear his voice. She just wanted him to say Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. It went straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Harrison Vance. I'm currently out of the office enjoying the holiday weekend in Aspen. Please leave a message." Aspen. He was skiing in Aspen with her money, while she ate a microwave turkey patty in a freezing room. She hadn't left a message. She had just sat there and let the food grow cold. By the second week of December, Eleanor was running on fumes. She was exhausted, malnourished, and her spirit was finally breaking. She was beginning to think that maybe Harrison was right. Maybe she was just a useless old woman taking up space. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sky outside a bruised, stormy purple. The lunch rush was completely insane. A convention was in town, and the diner was packed shoulder to shoulder with men in suits. Eleanor was running frantically between tables, balancing 4 plates of burgers on her arms, sweat stinging her eyes. Theo was sitting at his usual booth in the corner. He had already finished his soup, but he stayed, quietly reading a newspaper, providing a calm anchor in the storm of the restaurant. "Vance!" Gary screamed from the kitchen window. "Table 9 needs service. VIPs! They just walked in, look like money. Don't mess this up." Eleanor wiped her forehead with the back of her sleeve, grabbed her notepad, and hurried toward the large circular booth near the front windows. There were 4 men sitting there, shrugging off expensive wool overcoats, laughing loudly. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said, forcing a bright customer service smile as she approached the table, her head down as she pulled a pen from her apron. "Welcome to Maple Street. Can I start you off with some coffee, or—" She looked up. The notepad slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a soft slap. Sitting in the center of the booth, wearing a bespoke navy blue suit, a Rolex gleaming on his wrist, and a confident, arrogant smirk on his face, was her son, Harrison. For a single, agonizing second, the entire universe shrank to the space between Eleanor's sensible, rubber-soled work shoes and the polished Italian leather of her son's loafers. The diner around her, the clattering plates, the shouting cooks, the smell of burnt coffee, faded into a dull, rushing static, like the roar of an ocean in her ears. Harrison's laughter died in his throat. He had been mid-sentence, entertaining the 3 older, impeccably dressed men at his table. He turned his head, the smug, confident smile still half-pasted on his face, and his eyes met hers. Eleanor saw the exact moment recognition hit him. It wasn't a slow dawning. It was a violent shock that drained the color from his face. His eyes widened, darting frantically over her faded polyester uniform, the crooked name tag, the graying hair escaping her hairnet, and finally, the cheap plastic notepad lying on the scuffed linoleum between them. She opened her mouth. The word Harry formed on her tongue, an instinctive, desperate plea from a mother to her child. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected him to stand up. She expected him to pull her aside, to look horrified at what his actions had driven her to finally show a sliver of the boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee. Instead, Eleanor watched a chilling transformation take place. The shock in Harrison's eyes morphed into panic, and then, almost instantly, hardened into a wall of pure, unadulterated ice. He glanced quickly at the men sitting with him, men who reeked of old money, country clubs, and corporate power. Harrison had spent his entire adult life trying to convince people like this that he was one of them. He had likely spun them a narrative of a wealthy, comfortable family background, a pedigree that justified his presence at their table. Having his mother appear as a minimum-wage waitress in a greasy spoon diner was not just an embarrassment to him, it was a threat to the elaborate, fraudulent life he had built. "Is there a problem, Harrison?" asked the man sitting across from him, a silver-haired executive with a sharp, inquisitive gaze. He looked from Harrison to Eleanor, his brow furrowing slightly at her frozen state. Harrison swallowed hard. His jaw clenched. He looked right through Eleanor, his eyes entirely devoid of recognition, empathy, or love. "No, Richard. No problem at all," Harrison said, his voice smooth, recovering its arrogant cadence with a speed that made Eleanor feel physically sick. He looked down at the notepad on the floor, then back up at Eleanor, his lip curling in a micro-expression of absolute disgust. "It seems our waitress is just a bit clumsy, or perhaps a bit confused." The words hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. The breath rushed out of her lungs. She stood paralyzed, her hands trembling violently. "He is pretending he doesn't know me." "Well, don't just stand there staring," Harrison snapped, his tone laced with the impatient cruelty of a master addressing a servant. "Pick it up. We have a very tight schedule today, and we'd like to order." A hot, prickling wave of humiliation crawled up Eleanor's neck and flooded her cheeks. She could feel the eyes of the other men on her, judging her, pitying her. She felt stripped naked, her dignity ripped away in the middle of a crowded room by the child she had carried in her womb. Her knees buckled slightly. With jerky, robotic movements, driven purely by the terrifying necessity of keeping her job, the 65-year-old woman bent down. Her arthritic spine screamed in protest. Her fingers, swollen and aching, fumbled on the dirty floor, struggling to grasp the plastic edge of the notepad. As she was bent over, humiliatingly subservient at his feet, Harrison leaned in slightly toward his colleagues. He didn't whisper. He spoke just loudly enough for Eleanor to hear every single word. "You see it all the time with this demographic," Harrison said, a faux sympathetic sigh in his voice. "People who make poor financial choices in their youth, who refuse to adapt, who squander their resources. They end up in their twilight years wiping tables because they simply didn't have the foresight to manage their assets. It's sad, really, but it's a harsh lesson in personal responsibility." A tear, hot and stinging, escaped Eleanor's eye and fell onto the linoleum, landing an inch from Harrison's expensive shoe. He wasn't just ignoring her. He was using her misery, a misery he had engineered, as a prop to impress his boss. He was standing on her throat to make himself look taller. She managed to pick up the notepad and slowly straightened her back. Her vision was blurry with unshed tears. She couldn't speak. If she opened her mouth, a sob would tear out of her, and she would shatter completely. "Just bring us 4 black coffees to start, and make sure the cups are actually clean," Harrison ordered, dismissing her with a flick of his wrist. As he did, he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and deliberately let it flutter to the floor, right where she had just been kneeling. "For your trouble," he said coldly. "Buy yourself some better shoes. You look pathetic." The other men at the table chuckled uncomfortably, looking away. Eleanor stared at the money on the floor. Her soul felt like it had been crushed into a fine powder and blown away by the diner's ventilation system. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. She wanted to die. She slowly began to bend down again, her spirit entirely broken, ready to accept the ultimate degradation. "Leave it." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the ambient noise of the diner like a heavy steel blade through silk. Eleanor stopped. She turned her head, blinking away the tears. Theodore was standing. The old man, who for weeks had seemed like nothing more than a fragile fixture of the corner booth, had risen, and as he stepped out into the aisle, the illusion of his frailty vanished completely. He didn't shuffle. He walked with a measured, predatory grace, his spine perfectly straight, his shoulders broad beneath the threadbare tweed coat. The ambient chatter in the immediate vicinity began to die down as people instinctively reacted to the sudden shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. Theo possessed an aura of quiet, terrifying authority, the kind of presence that did not demand attention, but commanded it absolutely. He walked past Eleanor, placing a gentle, remarkably steady hand on her shoulder for just a fraction of a second. It was a grounding touch, a silent anchor thrown to a drowning woman. "I am here," the touch said. "You are not alone." Theo stopped at the edge of Harrison's table. He looked down at this $20 bill on the floor, and then, with agonizing slowness, He raised his piercing blue eyes to meet Harrison's. Harrison frowned, annoyed by the interruption. He looked at Theo's worn clothes and scowled. "Excuse me, old man. This is a private table. Are you lost?" Theo did not blink. He reached down effortlessly, picked up the $20 bill, and placed it precisely in the center of Harrison's empty bread plate. "Arrogance," Theo began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the chest of everyone listening, "is a remarkably flimsy shield, young man. It shatters quite easily when struck by the truth." "I don't know who you think you are," Harrison sneered, though a faint flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. He puffed out his chest, trying to assert dominance. "But you need to back away before I have the manager throw you out. You're bothering my guests." "I am merely making an observation," Theo continued, his tone conversational, but laced with a lethal chill. He leaned forward slightly, resting his knuckles on the edge of the table. He ignored the other executives entirely, focusing the full weight of his gaze solely on Harrison. "I have found in my long life," Theo said, articulating every syllable with crystalline precision, "that the men who are quickest to publicly humiliate the vulnerable are almost always hiding a profound, festering cowardice. They project their own sins onto others. They speak of personal responsibility and asset management to mask the stench of their own thievery." Harrison's face went rigid. The smugness vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. "Listen to me, you crazy old—" "For instance," Theo interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. "One might look at a man in a bespoke suit and see success. But another man might look at him and wonder, how did he acquire his capital? Did he earn it? Or did he, perhaps, exploit a fiduciary duty?" Harrison actually flinched. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. Theo wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his blue eyes locking onto Harrison's like a predator that had just found the jugular. "Did he perhaps take advantage of a grieving widow?" Theo asked softly, the words landing like hammer blows. "Did he forge signatures, manipulate a power of attorney, and commit fraudulent transfers of real property across state lines? Because if a man were to do such things, he wouldn't be a successful executive. He would be a felon." The silence at the table was absolute. The three other executives were staring at Harrison in shock. They didn't know the context, but the sheer, specific gravity of Theo's accusations hung in the air like poison gas. I don't know what you're talking about," Harrison stammered. His voice cracked. The confident mid-level executive had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, cornered little boy. A bead of sweat broke out on his forehead. "I think you do," Theo whispered. "Elder financial abuse is a fascinating area of the law. State and federal prosecutors tend to view it with extreme prejudice. A conviction carries a mandatory minimum in many jurisdictions, up to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. It ruins careers. It seizes assets. It destroys lives." Theo straightened up, adjusting his flat cap. He looked down at Harrison with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. "Do you ever lose sleep, young man?" Theo asked, his voice returning to its normal volume. "Or do you think the dark cannot find you just because you close your eyes? Consequences have a very long memory. I suggest you enjoy your coffee. It may be the best thing you drink for a very, very long time." Theo didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked back to Eleanor, who was standing frozen against the counter, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face. Harrison sat immobilized in his booth. He looked like a man who had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. He looked at his boss, Richard, who was staring at him with deep, suspicious scrutiny. "Harrison," Richard said slowly, "do you know that man?" "No," Harrison choked out, his hands trembling so badly he had to hide them under the table. He's just some crazy vagrant. He's talking nonsense." But the lie was transparent. Harrison abruptly stood up, nearly knocking over his chair. "Actually, Richard, gentlemen, I'm incredibly sorry. I just remembered a critical compliance meeting I absolutely cannot miss. We'll have to reschedule this lunch. My apologies. The drinks are on me." Without waiting for their reply, Harrison practically bolted for the door, not once looking back at his mother. His colleagues exchanged bewildered, deeply concerned glances, threw some cash on the table, and followed him out a moment later. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully as they left, a mocking sound in the heavy atmosphere of the diner. Eleanor's knees finally gave out. She slumped against the counter, sliding down until she was sitting on the sticky linoleum, burying her face in her hands. The dam broke. Sobs tore through her chest, loud and ragged, the culmination of months of suppressed agony, the heartbreak of her son's final, undeniable rejection, and the overwhelming shock of what had just transpired. "Vance!" Gary's voice boomed from the kitchen. The manager stomped out, his face red with fury. "What the hell is going on out here? You just drove away a VIP table. You're sitting on the floor crying? Get up! You're fired! Pack your—" Gary stopped mid-sentence. Theo had stepped directly into Gary's path. The old man didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threatening gesture. He simply looked at Gary. "Eleanor is taking the rest of the day off," Theo said quietly. "Who the hell are you to tell me?" Gary blustered, trying to push past. Theo reached into his frayed tweed coat. He didn't pull out coins this time. He pulled out a sleek black leather wallet, opened it, and extracted 3 crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. He pressed them flat onto the counter, right under Gary's nose. "She is taking the day off," Theo repeated, his voice cold iron. "And she will be back on Thursday for her scheduled shift. If she loses a single hour of pay, or if you ever speak to her in that tone of voice again, I promise you, Gary, the health inspector will find violations in your kitchen that will ensure this establishment never serves another cup of coffee. Do we understand each other?" Gary stared at the money, then at Theo's eyes. The bully in Gary immediately recognized a predator infinitely higher on the food chain. He swallowed hard, nodded mutely, and scooped up the cash, retreating back into the kitchen without another word. Theo turned and knelt beside Eleanor on the floor. He didn't care about the dirt or the grease on his trousers. He reached out and gently wrapped his large, warm hands around her trembling, arthritic ones. "Come with me, Eleanor," he said softly, all the ice completely gone from his voice, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth. "Your shift is over. Let's get you out of here." Eleanor looked up at him through her tears. She was utterly bewildered, terrified, and heartbroken. But as she looked into the old man's eyes, she saw the one thing she hadn't seen since Robert died. She saw safety. She let him help her to her feet. She untied her grease-stained apron, dropping it on the counter, and let Theo guide her out the door into the biting December wind. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know how this poor old man knew the legal terms that had made her son turn white as a sheet. All she knew was that for the first time in 2 years, the crushing, suffocating darkness that surrounded her life had a single, tiny crack of light shining through it. And as Theo hailed a passing yellow cab, something he supposedly could never afford, Eleanor realized that the man she had been feeding scraps of bread to was not at all who he appeared to be. The yellow cab smelled of stale vanilla air freshener and old vinyl, but to Eleanor, it felt like a sanctuary. She sat huddled against the door, her coat pulled tight around her, the adrenaline of the diner slowly draining away to leave a bone-deep, shivering exhaustion. Beside her, Theodore sat in quiet composure. The frayed tweed coat was the same. The worn flat cap rested on his knee, but the man wearing them had entirely transformed. He was no longer the fragile, invisible old man who counted pennies for soup. He radiated a quiet, unshakable authority. He instructed the driver to take them to an address in the financial district, an area of the city Eleanor hadn't set foot in since Robert was alive. When the cab pulled up to the curb, Theo didn't let her touch the door handle. He stepped out first, offering his hand. He led her not to a diner, but to the heavy brass-studded oak doors of the Vanguard Club, a private establishment where the city's oldest money and highest power brokered their deals in hushed tones over scotch and rare steaks. Eleanor hung back, suddenly acutely aware of her grease-stained, sensible shoes and the faint smell of fryer oil clinging to her hair. "Theo, I can't go in there. Look at me. They won't even let us pass the lobby." Theo offered a small, gentle smile. "My dear Eleanor, the Vanguard Club does not judge its founding members by the cut of their coats. Please, trust me." He opened the door. The moment they stepped into the foyer, a vast expanse of rich mahogany, muted oil paintings, and thick, noise-absorbing Persian rugs, the maitre d', a man in a pristine tuxedo, rushed forward. Eleanor braced herself for the inevitable ejection. "Judge Caldwell," the maitre d' said, bowing his head respectfully, his eyes never once darting to Eleanor's shabby attire or Theo's threadbare tweed. "It is an absolute honor to have you back, sir. It has been far too long. Your usual private dining room?" Yes, Marcus, thank you, Theo replied, his voice returning to that rich, commanding baritone. And please, ask Chef Louis to prepare something warm and nourishing for my guest. She has had a remarkably difficult day. Eleanor walked through the hushed, opulent corridors in a state of stunned silence. When they were seated in a private room, warmed by a crackling fireplace and completely insulated from the outside world, a waiter immediately brought them crystal goblets of sparkling water and a silver basket of artisanal breads. Eleanor finally found her voice as the heavy mahogany door clicked shut, leaving them alone. "Judge Caldwell?" she whispered, staring at the man across the table. Theo let out a long, heavy sigh. He reached up and removed the frayed tweed coat, draping it over the back of his chair. Underneath, his shirt was indeed worn, but as she looked closer, she realized it was custom-tailored, the fabric a high-thread count Egyptian cotton that had simply been deliberately distressed. "Theodore Caldwell," he said softly. "Former Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, retired 3 years ago." Eleanor's mind spun. "But the soup, the pennies, why were you at Maple Street? Why were you pretending to be a pauper?" Theo looked down at his hands. The tremor she had seen for weeks was completely gone. His fingers were steady, strong. "When my wife Evelyn passed away, the world lost its color. She was my anchor, Eleanor. In my grief, I found myself surrounded by the sycophants and opportunists of my social circle. People who only saw my title, my pension, and my influence. They offered hollow condolences while quietly maneuvering for my favor. The sheer, suffocating falseness of it made me sick to my stomach." He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers, burning with a fierce, quiet intensity. "I wanted to disappear. I wanted to see what the world looked like from the bottom, without the shield of my wealth or my title. I wanted to know how society treats a man who has absolutely nothing to offer it." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. "And you found out?" "I found out that the world is remarkably cruel," Theo said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I found out that to most people, a poor old man is not a human being. He is an inconvenience, an eyesore. But then, I sat in a terrible diner, and a woman who was clearly exhausted, clearly suffering, and clearly terrified of losing her livelihood, risked her job to slip me 2 slices of warm buttered bread." Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes again, but this time they were not tears of humiliation. "You didn't know who I was, Eleanor," Theo continued, reaching across the table to gently cover her hand with his. "You thought I was poorer than you, but you fed me anyway. In a world completely devoid of grace, you showed me mercy. You saved my life, Eleanor. Not my physical life, but my faith in humanity." A waiter entered silently, placing bowls of rich, creamy lobster bisque and a plate of delicate roasted vegetables between them, before vanishing just as quickly. "Eat," Theo commanded gently. "You are dangerously malnourished. And while you eat, you are going to tell me exactly what that young man did to you." Sitting in the warmth of the fire, bolstered by the first decent meal she had eaten in a year, the dam inside Eleanor completely broke. She didn't hold anything back. She told him about the grief, the sedatives, the confusing paperwork. She told him about the house being sold out from under her, the drained bank accounts, the maxed-out credit cards, and the final crushing voicemail from Aspen. She told him about the shame that had kept her silent, the terrible, consuming belief that she had somehow brought this upon herself by being too old, too trusting, too foolish. Theo listened in absolute silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply listened with the focused, terrifying intensity of a Supreme Court justice hearing a capital case. As she spoke, Eleanor watched his jaw tighten, his eyes hardening into chips of blue ice. When she finally finished, her voice a raspy whisper, silence stretched across the room, broken only by the popping of the firewood. "I thought it was my fault," Eleanor whispered, staring at her empty soup bowl. "He's my son. I raised him. If he could do this to me, what did I do wrong?" "You loved him," Theo said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a judge's gavel. "You loved him with a mother's blind, unconditional trust. That is not a flaw, Eleanor. That is a virtue. What Harrison did was exploit the holiest bond on this earth for financial gain." Theo leaned back in his chair, tenting his fingers together. The empathetic friend from the diner was gone. In his place sat a master tactician going to war. "You asked me earlier why I didn't use my money to simply buy you out of that diner," Theo said. It's because throwing money at this problem doesn't fix it. It doesn't restore your dignity, and it doesn't punish the guilty. Harrison believes he is untouchable. He believes he outsmarted a defenseless old woman. Theo reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, modern smartphone, a stark contrast to his vintage aesthetic. "We are not going to use my money, Eleanor," Theo said, his eyes locking onto hers. "We are going to use the law. And I assure you, nobody in this state wields the law quite like I do." The next 3 days were a whirlwind that left Eleanor breathless. She did not return to her freezing studio apartment. Theo had insisted she stay in the guest wing of his brownstone on the Upper East Side, a beautiful, sunlit room overlooking a private garden, with a bed so soft Eleanor wept the first night she slept in it. The brownstone's library, a massive room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound legal volumes, became their war room. Theo did not work alone. A single phone call from the former Chief Justice had mobilized a terrifyingly efficient strike force. Enter Sarah Lynn, a 32-year-old forensic accountant who used to clerk for Theo, now a rising star at the federal prosecutor's office. Sarah was a whirlwind of sharp suits, tablets, and relentless energy. She treated Eleanor not with pity, but with deep professional respect. On Thursday morning, Sarah laid out a series of oversized, high-resolution prints on the heavy oak desk in the library. "Okay, Eleanor," Sarah said, pointing a laser pen at the documents. "We subpoenaed the original estate transfer documents and the power of attorney from the county clerk's office. I want you to look closely at page 7, the signature page." Eleanor put on her reading glasses and leaned over the desk. There was her signature, Eleanor Grace Vance. It looked shaky, exactly as it had when she was heavily sedated after Robert's funeral. "It's my signature," Eleanor said, her heart sinking. "I told you, Theo, I signed the papers. I was foolish." "Look closer," Theo urged from his leather armchair by the fire. "Look at the notary stamp." Eleanor squinted. Next to her signature was the raised seal and stamp of a notary public named David Corcoran. "I remember signing papers in my living room," Eleanor said slowly. "Harrison and Meredith were there, but there was no notary present. No one named David Corcoran was ever in my house." Sarah smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. "Exactly. In this state, a durable power of attorney transferring real property must be signed in the physical presence of a notary public. We pulled Mr. Corcoran's logbook. He claims you appeared before him in his downtown office on November 14th. The problem?" Sarah tapped a tablet screen, bringing up a medical record. "On November 14th, you were in the emergency room being treated for a severe panic attack, brought on by grief. We have the hospital admission logs. You physically could not have been in Corcoran's office." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He forged it?" "Worse," Theo said grimly. "Corcoran is a dirty notary known to the ethics board. Harrison paid him to fraudulently backdate and stamp a document you signed under duress and heavy medication, without a witness. That is not a misunderstanding, Eleanor. That is felony fraud. It instantly invalidates the power of attorney." "But that's not the biggest twist," Sarah interrupted, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. She swiped to a new screen, displaying a complex web of financial wire transfers. "Judge Caldwell asked me to follow the money. I tracked the proceeds from the sale of your home and the cash advances from your credit cards." "Harrison said he needed it to network," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with rising anger. "To keep up appearances for his career." "Harrison is an idiot," Sarah said bluntly. "He's a middle management suit making $120,000 a year, trying to live like a billionaire. But he didn't orchestrate this. He's not smart enough to set up the shell companies we found." Sarah tapped the screen, highlighting a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and a massive wire transfer to a title company in California. "The money from your house didn't go into Harrison's investment portfolio," Sarah explained. $700,000 was wired to purchase a beachfront vacation home in Carmel by the Sea, and another $200,000 went to clear massive high-limit debts at an underground casino. Eleanor felt dizzy. "Harrison doesn't gamble. He's always been terrified of risk." "You're right. He doesn't," Theo said, standing up and walking over to the desk. He looked at Eleanor with profound sympathy. "The deed to the house in Carmel and the gambling debts. They don't belong to Harrison." Sarah hit a button and a photograph filled the screen. It was Meredith, Eleanor's daughter-in-law. She was standing on the balcony of a stunning oceanfront home, holding a glass of champagne, laughing radiantly. The accounts, the property, the debts, they are all held under a solitary LLC, Sarah said quietly. Owned exclusively by Meredith Vance, using her maiden name. Harrison isn't even on the deed. The room fell dead silent. Eleanor stared at the smiling face of her daughter-in-law. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Meredith's saccharine sweetness at the funeral. Meredith's manicured hands guiding Eleanor's pen to the sticky notes. Meredith's text message telling her to stand on her own 2 feet. Harrison hadn't destroyed his mother out of sheer malice or cold corporate greed. He had destroyed his mother because he was a weak, pathetic, cowardly man, utterly manipulated and controlled by a wife whose insatiable greed and hidden gambling addiction required a massive influx of cash. Harrison had sold his own mother's soul to buy his wife's affection and cover her crimes. A new emotion began to bloom in Eleanor's chest. For 2 years she had felt only sorrow, shame, and a desperate, pathetic longing for her son's love. She had felt like a victim. But looking at the undeniable proof of Meredith's calculated theft and Harrison's spineless complicity, the sorrow evaporated. The shame burned away. In its place rose something Eleanor Vance had not felt in a very, very long time, a pure, blinding, righteous fury. She took off her reading glasses and placed them deliberately on the desk. She looked at Sarah, and then at Theo. Her spine, which had been bowed by the weight of grease and grief for 2 years, straightened perfectly. The tired waitress from Maple Street Diner was gone. "Theo," Eleanor said, her voice steady, cold, and echoing with the terrifying strength of a mother who has finally realized her child has become a monster. "I don't just want my money back." Theo smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. "I know, Eleanor. What do you want?" "I want them to feel exactly what I felt," Eleanor said, looking back at the picture of Meredith's smiling face. "I want to take everything." The bait was set with surgical precision. Sarah Lynn, operating from the leather-scented war room of Theo's brownstone, had not filed a lawsuit. Lawsuits took months, involved endless discovery phases, and gave the guilty time to hide their assets. Instead, Sarah had simply sent a formal, certified letter of inquiry from the federal prosecutor's office directly to David Corcoran, the corrupt notary public. "Rats do not fight when cornered," Theo had explained to Eleanor the night before, pouring her a cup of decaf tea. "They panic, and they bite the nearest thing to them. Corcoran will immediately call Harrison to warn him that the federal government is looking into the power of attorney. Harrison, who already knows you encountered someone who threatened him with legal action at the diner, will assume you managed to find a pro bono lawyer." "And then?" Eleanor had asked, her hands wrapped tightly around the warm porcelain mug. "And then, he will come for you," Theo had said softly. "He will try to silence you before whatever investigation you've triggered can bear fruit. We need him to do this. We need to demonstrate to the court not just that he stole from you, but that he is actively, maliciously engaging in witness intimidation and elder abuse. We need him to hang himself with his own words." Which was why, on a bitterly cold Friday evening, Eleanor found herself back in the freezing, mildew-scented studio apartment she had thought she'd escaped forever. She sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, wearing her heavy winter coat. In her pocket sat the sleek smartphone Theo had given her, its voice recorder already activated, capturing the ambient drip of the leaky kitchen faucet. Outside, parked discreetly in an unmarked black sedan down the street, were 2 private investigators Theo had retained, just in case Harrison became physically violent. But Eleanor wasn't afraid of physical violence. She was bracing herself for something much worse. At exactly 6:15 p.m., heavy footsteps echoed in the narrow, poorly lit hallway outside. They stopped. A sharp, aggressive knock rattled the flimsy wooden door. Eleanor closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and channeled 40 years of dealing with belligerent doctors and hysterical patients in the neonatal ward. She locked away her heartbreak. She locked away the mother who had rocked this man to sleep. She became iron. She stood up, walked to the door, and unbolted it. Harrison stood in the hallway. The arrogant, untouchable executive from the diner was gone. His tie was loosened, his hair was slightly disheveled, and the skin around his eyes was tight with stress and lack of sleep. He looked around the squalid hallway with visceral disgust before pushing his way past her into the apartment without being invited. "Jesus, Mom, it smells like a sewer in here," he muttered, pulling his expensive wool coat tighter around himself as the ambient cold of the room hit him. How do you live like this? You put me here, Harrison, Eleanor said quietly, closing the door and leaning against it. Harrison whipped around, his eyes darting around the small room as if looking for hidden cameras, though he clearly didn't suspect the phone in her pocket. Cut the martyr act. We don't have time for it. What the hell did you do? I don't know what you mean. Don't play dumb with me, Harrison shouted, his voice echoing off the bare walls. He paced the small floor space like a caged animal. Corcoran called me this morning. He's panicking. He got a letter of inquiry from the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding the notary seal on Dad's estate transfer. And then there was that crazy old man at the diner. Who was he? Some ambulance-chasing lawyer you found on a billboard? Eleanor kept her face perfectly blank. He was a friend, someone who saw a woman being abused and decided to help. Harrison let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. Help? You think he's helping you? Mom, you are way out of your depth here. You think you can just sick some cut-rate legal aid on me and what? Undo the past? The papers are signed. The assets are liquidated. Corcoran wasn't at the house when I signed those papers, Harry, Eleanor said, keeping her voice low, reasonable, drawing him in. You and Meredith had him backdate a fraudulent stamp. That's a crime. Harrison stopped pacing. He stared at her, his chest heaving slightly. He realized she knew. The gaslighting about her forgetfulness wasn't going to work anymore. He had to pivot. And as Eleanor watched, the last remaining shred of the boy she had loved vanished, replaced by a ruthless, cornered corporate animal. Okay, fine, Harrison said, his voice dropping into a deadly clinical register. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, tossing it onto the small, wobbly kitchen table. Let's play it your way. What is that? That, Harrison said, pointing a sharp finger at the folder, is a legal waiver. It's an ironclad non-disclosure and release of claims agreement. It states that you voluntarily transferred all assets to me, that you are fully satisfied with my management of the estate, and that you waive any right to sue me, Meredith, or David Corcoran. Eleanor looked at the folder, then back up at her son. And why would I ever sign that? Harrison took a step closer to her. The sheer malice radiating from him made the freezing room feel suffocating. Because if you don't, Harrison whispered, I will destroy whatever little life you have left. Eleanor forced her hands to remain still at her sides. You already took my home. You took my savings. You left me to starve. What else could you possibly take from me? Harrison reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a single sheet of paper with a hospital letterhead. He held it up so she could see the crest. I have friends, Mom, Harrison said, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting his lips. I play golf with the chief of psychiatry at St. Jude's. He's an investor in one of my funds. For a favor, he was more than happy to review your medical history, the grief counseling you went to after Dad died, the sedatives you were prescribed, the panic attacks you claimed to have. A cold dread began to pool in Eleanor's stomach. It was a primal, terrifying fear that resonated deep within the bones of every aging woman. The fear of losing autonomy, the fear of being erased. He has drafted a preliminary medical evaluation, Harrison continued, his voice dripping with venom. It states that you are suffering from rapid-onset vascular dementia, compounded by severe delusions and paranoia. It states that you are a danger to yourself, that you are making up wild stories about your family stealing from you because your brain is literally rotting. That's a lie, Eleanor breathed, genuinely horrified by the depth of his depravity. I am perfectly sane. It doesn't matter what you are, Harrison snapped. It matters what the paper says. If you do not sign this waiver right now and call off whatever legal dog you've unleashed, I will file this evaluation with the state court tomorrow morning. I will petition for emergency involuntary medical guardianship. He took another step, towering over her. Do you know what that means, Mom? It means you become a legal non-entity. You won't be allowed to make a single decision for yourself. I will have you forcibly removed from this apartment by the police. I will lock you up in a state-run, minimum-care psychiatric nursing facility. Not the nice ones with the gardens, the ones where they strap you to a bed so you don't wander the halls, where they drug you until you drool on yourself, where the staff doesn't even bother to learn your name. Eleanor stared into the eyes of her son. She searched for a flicker of hesitation, a hint of bluffing. There was none. He was entirely willing to throw his mother into a living nightmare, to strip her of her human rights, just to protect the money he had stolen to appease his wife. "You'll rot there, Mom," Harrison hissed, leaning in so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You'll die in a room that smells like bleach and urine, and no one will ever believe a word you say because you're just a crazy old woman. No lawyer can help you once you're declared legally incompetent. I will own you." The silence in the room was absolute, save for the dripping faucet. For 2 years, Eleanor had cried. She had wept for her husband, wept for her lost home, wept for the son she thought she had failed. But now, staring into the abyss of Harrison's cruelty, the tears dried up completely. The fear that had gripped her just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. He had just handed her the sword she needed to cut him down. "Are you finished, Harry?" Eleanor asked. Harrison blinked, taken aback by the eerie calmness of her voice. He had expected hysterics. He had expected her to drop to her knees and beg. "I'm not playing games, Mom. Sign the paper." "No." Eleanor stepped away from the door and walked past him, moving to the small kitchenette. She didn't look at him. "Did you hear what I just said?" Harrison yelled, his frustration boiling over. "I will lock you away." "I heard every word," Eleanor said smoothly. She turned to face him, her posture impeccably straight. "You are going to declare me incompetent. You are going to use a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation to have me committed to a state facility against my will, all to cover up the fact that you and Meredith forged a notary signature to steal my life savings so she could buy a beach house in Carmel and pay off her gambling debts." Harrison froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. How do you know about Carmel?" Eleanor ignored the question. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the smartphone. She tapped the screen once, stopping the recording, and held the device up. "Because, Harrison, the man at the diner wasn't a cut-rate lawyer," Eleanor said, her voice ringing with the absolute, unyielding authority of a matriarch. "He is Theodore Caldwell, former Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, and he has federal prosecutors looking into every single bank account you and your wife have ever opened." Harrison staggered backward, bumping into the wobbly kitchen table. The manila folder slid off onto the floor. He stared at the phone in her hand, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. You recorded me?" he whispered, the reality of what he had just confessed on tape crashing down on him. Extortion, witness intimidation, threatening to file false medical documents. "I did," Eleanor said coldly. "And this audio file is already automatically backed up to a secure cloud server monitored by Judge Caldwell's legal team. Even if you try to take this phone from me, they have it." Harrison looked like he was going to vomit. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The master manipulator had walked blindly into a meticulously crafted trap. "Mom, wait. Mom, please," Harrison stammered, holding his hands up, instantly reverting to a pathetic, begging posture. "I was just angry. I didn't mean it. I would never actually put you in a home. The stress. Meredith, she pushes me. She spends so much I didn't know what to do." "Do not put this entirely on your wife," Eleanor snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "She may be the architect, but you were the willing executioner. You looked me in the eye at that diner and threw $20 at my feet. You own this, Harrison." "I'll give it back," he cried out, tears of genuine panic welling in his eyes. "I'll sell the Carmel house. I'll pay you back every cent. Just delete the recording, please. If you give this to a prosecutor, I'll go to prison. I'll lose my career. I'll lose everything." Eleanor looked at the man weeping before her. A part of her, the deeply buried, instinctual part of a mother, wanted to comfort him, wanted to say, "It's okay, I forgive you." But she remembered the dripping faucet. She remembered the freezing nights. She remembered the agonizing pain in her feet at the diner. And she remembered the absolute, chilling deadness in his eyes when he threatened to lock her in a psychiatric ward. Mercy was for people who had lost their way. Harrison hadn't lost his way. He had chosen it. "You should have thought about your career before you stole a widow's pension," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any warmth. She pointed to the door. "Get out of my apartment." "Mom, please." Harrison dropped to his knees, his expensive trousers soaking up the grime of the linoleum floor. He reached out to grab her coat. "I'm your son." Eleanor stepped back, out of his reach. She looked down at him, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow pity. "My son died 2 years ago, right around the time his father did. Eleanor said softly, delivering the final devastating blow. I don't know who you are. Leave. Now. Before I call the men sitting in the black sedan downstairs to physically remove you. Harrison looked up at her, realizing with absolute certainty that there was no manipulation left to play. The well of a mother's unconditional love, which he had so arrogantly believed was bottomless, had finally run dry. He slowly climbed to his feet, a broken, terrified shell of a man. He didn't say another word. He stumbled out the door and disappeared into the dark hallway. Eleanor stood alone in the quiet apartment. She didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She took a deep breath of the cold air, feeling a strange, intoxicating lightness in her chest. The chains were gone. She lifted the phone, dialed Theo's number, and pressed it to her ear. He answered on the first ring. It's done, Theo, Eleanor said, a small, fierce smile touching her lips. We have him. Excellent work, Eleanor. Theo's warm, steady voice came through the speaker. Sarah is preparing the asset freeze warrants as we speak. Pack your things. The driver is waiting downstairs to bring you back home. Theo? Yes, my dear? I think I'm ready for the party. The clinking of baccarat crystal flutes and the low, sophisticated murmur of the city's financial elite filled the sprawling, open-concept living room. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and Wagyu beef crostini. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city skyline, a testament to the fact that this penthouse apartment cost more than most people would earn in 3 lifetimes. It was Harrison and Meredith's housewarming party, doubling as a celebration of Harrison's recent promotion to senior vice president. Meredith stood near the grand piano, holding court. She wore a stunning, backless emerald silk gown, her wrist heavy with a diamond tennis bracelet that had been purchased directly with the liquidated funds of Eleanor's retirement account. She laughed a high, musical laugh, touching the arm of a prominent real estate developer. Oh, you know how it is, Charles, Meredith purred, taking a delicate sip of champagne. It's just about making smart investments. Harrison and I believe in manifesting our reality through sheer hard work. We simply refuse to settle for mediocrity. Across the room, Harrison was not manifesting anything but sheer terror. He stood by the mahogany wet bar, downing his third neat scotch in less than 20 minutes. He was sweating through his custom-tailored suit. His eyes darted constantly to the heavy oak double doors of the penthouse. It had been 48 hours since he had fled his mother's squalid apartment. 48 hours since he realized his career, his freedom, and his entire life were hanging by the thread of a digital audio recording held by a former Supreme Court justice. He hadn't told Meredith. He had been too paralyzed by fear, hoping against hope that his mother was bluffing, that the old man wouldn't actually pull the trigger. Harry, darling, stop drinking, Meredith hissed, suddenly appearing at his side. She maintained her brilliant smile for the guests, but her voice was pure venom. You look like a cornered rat. Richard is over there talking to the partners. Go mingle. Show them you deserve this promotion. Meredith, we need to talk, Harrison choked out, his hand shaking so badly the ice clinked violently against his glass. Something happened. My mother... I do not want to hear a word about that crazy old bat tonight, Meredith snapped, her eyes flashing with irritation. I told you to deal with her. We are celebrating, Harrison. Do not ruin this for me. Before Harrison could explain that the celebration was built on a ticking time bomb, the ambient hum of the party abruptly ceased. It didn't happen all at once. It started near the foyer, a sudden hush that rippled through the crowd like a wave, accompanied by the parting of the guests. The string quartet in the corner faltered, the cellist pulling his bow away in confusion. Harrison turned, his stomach dropping into a bottomless abyss. The heavy oak doors were wide open. Standing in the threshold was Eleanor Vance. She did not look like the exhausted, greasy diner waitress Harrison had humiliated just days ago. She wore an impeccably tailored, charcoal gray wool suit that radiated understated elegance. Her silver hair was professionally styled, framing a face that was completely devoid of fear, sorrow, or hesitation. She looked like a queen stepping onto a battlefield. Beside her stood Theodore Caldwell. He was no longer playing the part of the invisible pauper. He wore a bespoke midnight blue suit that hung perfectly on his broad shoulders. He didn't just walk into the room, he owned it. The guests, lawyers, bankers, and corporate executives immediately recognized the man. Whispers of "Is that Judge Caldwell? And what is the former Chief Justice doing here?" rippled through the penthouse. "Security!" Meredith barked, her voice shrill, instantly breaking her carefully cultivated facade. She marched forward, her face flushed with fury. "How did you get up here? Harrison, tell security to throw this woman out immediately. She has no right." "I wouldn't finish that sentence, Mrs. Vance." Theo's voice boomed, rich and resonant, echoing off the high ceilings. He didn't raise his voice to a shout, but the sheer, absolute authority in his tone froze Meredith in her tracks. Theo stepped forward, offering his arm to Eleanor. They walked into the center of the room, the sea of wealthy guests parting to give them a wide berth. "Harry, do something!" Meredith shrieked, looking at her husband. But Harrison couldn't move. He was staring at the doorway behind Eleanor and Theo. 4 figures stepped into the penthouse. 2 were uniformed federal marshals. The 3rd was a detective with the Financial Crimes Unit. The 4th was Sarah Lynn, carrying a thick leather-bound portfolio. "Harrison Vance?" Sarah asked, her voice clear and carrying across the silent room. Harrison let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. He dropped his Scotch glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound like a gunshot. "I am Sarah Lynn, Assistant United States Attorney," she announced, stepping forward and pulling a sheaf of documents from her portfolio. "Harrison Vance, I am serving you with a federal indictment for elder financial exploitation, wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit forgery. You are also being served with an emergency asset freeze." The crowd gasped. Several executives, including Harrison's boss, Richard, instinctively took a step back, physically distancing themselves from the radioactive center of the room. "This is ridiculous!" Meredith yelled, her face contorting with ugly rage. She pointed a manicured finger at Eleanor. "She's insane! She has dementia! She signed everything over to us voluntarily. Ask the doctor." "We did ask the doctor," Sarah Lynn replied sharply. "The chief of psychiatry at St. Jude's was very cooperative once the FBI mentioned his medical license was under review for fabricating psychiatric evaluations as a favor to your husband." Meredith turned pale. She whipped her head toward Harrison. "What is she talking about?" "And as for the voluntary signatures," Theo interjected, his eyes locking onto Meredith like a hawk eyeing a snake. "We also had a very illuminating conversation with David Corcoran. He confessed to backdating the notary stamp on the power of attorney. He also provided the wire transfer records that lead directly to an offshore shell company." Theo turned to the crowd, his voice projecting the facts of the case with brutal, clinical precision. "This man and his wife preyed upon a grieving widow. They forged documents to steal her home, her pension, and her life savings. And when confronted, this man threatened to use fabricated medical records to lock his own mother in a state psychiatric ward to silence her." A wave of absolute disgust washed over the guests. The silence was deafening. No, it wasn't me," Harrison suddenly screamed, his self-preservation instinct kicking in, overriding whatever loyalty he had left. He pointed a trembling finger at his wife. "It was her, Meredith. She had gambling debts. She wanted the house in Carmel. She forced me to do it. She told me how to get the papers signed." Meredith looked at her husband as if he had just transformed into an insect. The facade of the loving power couple shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. "You spineless coward!" Meredith spat, her voice dripping with venom. She lunged at him, slapping him hard across the face. The sound echoed sharply in the penthouse. "You think you can pin this on me? You signed the checks. You talked to Corcoran. I want a divorce, right now. I am taking half of everything and I am leaving you to rot." "That might be difficult, Mrs. Vance," Sarah Lynn said, stepping between them, a cold, satisfied smile on her face. She held up the legal documents. "As of 5 p.m. today, a federal judge signed an absolute freeze on all of your assets, the accounts in the Caymans, the property in Carmel, the cars, the jewelry you are currently wearing, even the catering for this party." Sarah handed the papers to a stunned, hyperventilating Harrison. "Everything you stole has been legally seized and placed into a restorative trust under the sole control of Eleanor Vance. You do not have half of anything to take in a divorce, Meredith. You don't even have the cab fare to leave this building." Meredith stared at Sarah, her mouth opening and closing in silent horror as the reality of her total ruin crashed down upon her. She looked at her diamond bracelet, then at the lavish penthouse, realizing it was all gone. Dust in the wind. Harrison fell to his knees amid the shattered glass of his scotch. He looked up at his mother. There was no defiance left, only the pathetic, broken realization that he had gambled his soul and lost everything. "Mom!" Harrison sobbed, reaching a hand out toward her. "Mom, please, don't let them take me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Eleanor looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. The crowd of elites watched with bated breath, expecting the mother to crack, to show mercy, to beg the police to go easy on her son. But Eleanor Vance had spent 2 years paying for her mercy. She stepped closer to him. She didn't yell. She didn't sneer. She spoke with a quiet, profound sadness that was somehow more devastating than anger. "You aren't sorry for what you did, Harry," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "You are only sorry that you were caught. I gave you everything I had. I gave you my youth, my money, my love, and you looked at me wiping tables in a diner and told me I was pathetic." She looked at Meredith, who was shrinking back, trying to hide behind the grand piano. "You wanted to stand on your own 2 feet, Eleanor told them both. "Now you will." Eleanor turned to the detectives. "Officers, do your job." The marshals stepped forward, pulling Harrison's arms behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping into place was the loudest sound in the room. As they moved to cuff Meredith, she began to scream hysterically, struggling against the officers, her silk dress tearing as she was marched toward the elevator. Eleanor didn't watch them leave. She turned to Theo, who offered her his arm. She took it, her head held high, and together they walked out of the penthouse, leaving the stunned, silent crowd of high society behind them. 6 months later, the late spring sun warmed the stone patio of Theodore Caldwell's Upper East Side brownstone. The private garden was in full bloom, a riot of purple hydrangeas and yellow daffodils swaying gently in the breeze. Eleanor sat at a wrought iron patio table, a silver tea service laid out before her. She took a sip of Earl Grey, closing her eyes and listening to the peaceful chirping of the sparrows. She looked entirely different now. The hollows beneath her eyes were gone, replaced by the warm, healthy glow of a woman who slept soundly and lived without fear. The French doors opened and Theo walked out, carrying the morning edition of the New York Times. He took his seat across from her, his blue eyes crinkling with a warm smile. "Good morning, my dear," Theo said, pouring himself a cup of tea. "Good morning, Theo," Eleanor replied. "Any news?" "Just the usual," Theo said, opening the paper. He turned to the Metro section and tapped a small article near the bottom. "Though it appears Harrison's plea deal was finalized yesterday. 3 years in a minimum security federal facility, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and 5,000 hours of community service." Eleanor looked at the garden. A year ago, the thought of her son in prison would have destroyed her. Now she felt only a distant, objective sense of closure. "And Meredith?" Eleanor asked. She tried to fight the charges, claiming she was coerced by Harrison. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. She received 5 years, Theo said, folding the paper and setting it aside. He reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. "Are you all right?" "I am," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand back. And it was the absolute truth. The restorative trust Sarah Lynn had set up had recovered every single penny that had been stolen from her. The Carmel Beach house had been sold, the Cayman accounts drained, and the money safely deposited back where it belonged. Eleanor was once again a wealthy woman. But she hadn't bought a mansion or a sports car. She had bought a mid-sized commercial office space downtown. "Sarah called this morning," Eleanor said, a bright, genuine smile lighting up her face. "The permit's cleared. The Vance Caldwell Foundation for Elder Justice officially opens its doors on Monday. We already have 3 pro bono lawyers signed up, and a waiting list of 20 seniors who need help fighting fraudulent evictions and financial abuse." Theo beamed with profound pride. "You have taken the darkest chapter of your life, Eleanor, and turned it into a shield for those who cannot fight for themselves. I have never known a stronger woman." Eleanor looked at the man sitting across from her. The man who had sat in a diner, pretending to be a pauper, searching for a single scrap of genuine human kindness. He had given her back her life, and in return, she had given him a reason to live his. She realized that the family she had mourned for 2 years, the idyllic, picture-perfect son and daughter-in-law, had never really existed. It had been an illusion, built on obligation and one-sided sacrifice. True family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who sat with you in the dark. It was about the people who saw you at your absolute lowest, covered in diner grease and drowning in despair, and chose to offer you their hand instead of turning away. Eleanor picked up her teacup, looking out over the blooming garden. She had lost a son, but she had found her voice, her power, and her purpose. And as Theo smiled at her over the rim of his cup, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that her golden years were finally about to begin.